Hello, committee, and for the online audience, sorry for the late start. We had some technical difficulties. So today we are going to get an update on school budgets and continue to discuss the yield bill. Have our first conversation about sports wagering, H127, and then get a fiscal note on H76 and hopefully, which is the captive insurance bill, and ideally vote on that if nothing comes up. And so with that, and does anyone have any, I don't know, public service announcements? Okay. Brad, if you want to join us and talk us through the new numbers you have for us.
We shall see.
Oh, that's a public service announcement that I'm going to make. So we're going to try this week a new procedure. Thanks, Sorsha, for the word. If we have witnesses in the chair, going to ask them to screen share so that we can all be sort of focused in the same place. And then if we do have witnesses on the screen, we'll look at our own computers so that we can see their faces, but try to default to screen sharing for shared documents so we can have more of a shared experience. And Brad is going to be our guinea pig. I'm so sorry, Brad. I know this is not your favorite. Appreciate it. It is a simple document, though.
It's a simple document. It's from a simple mind. Brad James, Agency of Education, here to be entertained by you guys and talk about preliminary budgets that we've got in. And so now we're going to try to hit screen share, source share. Okay. This is not my strong suit, folks, so bear with me. Take it twice. There we go.
You get Calvin to do it.
You get Calvin to do it like that.
There you go.
That's your whole spreadsheet. Is that what you wanted to show us?
Well, no, I'll take this back.
Okay.
The page happened to open on. So this is where
It's impressive.
this,
Yeah.
that's my world. This is, I think, yes, where we are. Is that large enough? Because I can make it larger. Not 100% sure what you guys are seeing behind.
That's great. That's perfect.
Oh, okay. All right. So last time I was in, I think we had 86, 88 budgets, something like that. That was 24. We had 86 budgets in. We now have 109 in. So we're up to, just over 93% of the budget. So I'm feeling pretty comfortable with what we've got here. Education spending with this latest round is up to just under 7.8%. If you recall, when we did the December 1 letter, I was projected at 8.5%, just over. So we're doing better than anticipated, which is always good news. We have almost 91% of the equalized pupils. And again, that's another measure of how we're doing. So we're missing about roughly 10% of the equalized pupils in the state. But I think at this point, we're kind of focusing, and this is in the ballpark of where we're going to be. The big outlier is still Burlington. I have not heard from them. So I don't know where they stand on things. I might try a phone call next. But again, they have the potential to move the needle, depending again on what they're doing with their budget and what their first year of annual principal interest payments are. Generally speaking, they pay interest the first year, I think. And it's usually reasonably sized, but I don't know what those numbers are at this point. But I will try to find out and get it. The other one, these are the remaining three from the top 10 that I showed you last time, was Milton. The business manager for Milton was out sick for the last week. And I heard from her last night. She was apologized, said, don't worry about it, get better. And she'll get it as soon as she can. I'm sure we'll have it next week at this point. And then we dropped down to Oxbow, which was the very last one. It's not very large, but it's, it was one of the top 10. So these are the three from the top 10 that you saw last time. They're still out. And again, as I said, the large one is Burlington. Last time around, though, we had $351 million out, if I recall correctly. I should look before I say that. Yes, $351 million that of those 10, we've cut that by 2/3. So we're, as I said, I have the feeling we're going to come somewhere in that 8% range, somewhere in that range for increased spending overall for the state for FY24. That's kind of where it stands at the moment. anybody have any questions you'd like to see your district or any, no.
So
Go ahead.
just a comment, so my math tells me that coming in at 7.78 instead of 8.5 is about 11, translates to about 11 million bucks.
Probably roughly, yeah, probably roughly.
About a penny on the, if you look at it, about a penny.
Yeah, I think it depends on where you put it, but on both sides, it'd probably be closer to a penny and a half, maybe something like that. It's about 9 pennies, something like that, I think, for the two together. I'm kind of looking at Julie in the background there. Those numbers change a little bit.
Okay.
A little over a penny is my guess for both sides.
Fred, I'm realizing that I'm used to sort of seeing the growth through COVID times, when there was all that federal money coming in directly to districts. And so I'm curious to hear from you sort of this year over year growth, where you would put it compared to, say, like the longer
pre-COVID.
history that
Longer history. Well, it varied. The longer history varied. But in general, I mean, the numbers that we're seeing now, I think, are higher than what we usually see, fairly significantly. I think education spending probably would average maybe 3%, somewhere in that range, give or take a percentage point. Some years it was high, some years, 1 year it actually went down. That was once. But so I think, generally speaking, the average growth would be, again, somewhere in the 3 to 3.5% range, something like that. If I look at it long term, the last few years it has been high. This year it's coming in higher than we anticipated, not than we anticipated, but prior years. And last year was the same situation. The year before that, though, when we were in COVID, where we did have a lot of federal money floating, that I think that tamped it down because people were still using that for a lot of things that they're now starting to pick up on their own as the COVID money starts to expire. We've lost the first round of COVID money. I think as Jill Briggs Campbell said the other day, and we're headed towards losing the second one in a couple months. Well,
meaning finishing spending.
Yes, not losing. My apologies. Yes, having it expire in terms of being able to use it.
And because it's been expended.
Yes,
Okay.
been expended or it's obligated or something. Yeah, it's being used. There's no question about it. The danger with that money is, as I think Jill said at some point, and as you all know, is that if they're taking that money and building something they want to continue forward, that's going to end up on their budget. And I don't know if that's part of what we're seeing here or not. I wouldn't be surprised if some of it is. But again, that's a question where I need to sit down and really hammer it out with the business manager, see what's really happening with them and what they can tell us.
In my fairly casual conversations with districts, it's, a lot of that was spent on learning loss, as it was supposed to be spent on, and mental health
Yep.
sort of related to learning loss. And it doesn't seem like any of those needs have lessened just because the federal money went away. It's not like it's not a quick fix. And so I guess I'm wondering, like, what sort of the broader conversation?
Well, you're right. I think in terms of the impact of COVID, I mean, just because the federal money is being used up and is not being continued, the issues aren't. There are still learning losses. Again, I'm not the best person qualified to talk about this.
Yeah.
There are still learning losses that people are dealing with. Representative Beck asked me probably 3 or 4 weeks ago at this point. He had been hearing that extraordinary special education costs were spiking. So I talked to the business manager, and sure enough, they said, yes, they're seeing those extraordinary expenses increase. Those are the costs for an individual student who, I guess, this current year, it's above $60,000. Those costs are going up significantly. Out-of-state placements are going up significantly. I think a large part of that is because people can't find people workers. I think that's a piece of it. Special ed, yeah. State and also state place kids and such. So, I mean, there are a lot of those factors in there, but COVID did exacerbate some of the special education needs. It exacerbated the needs for some of the regular kids who, are dealing with learning loss. They started a lot of summer programs with a lot of the federal money that I think are continuing on. So those will probably show up people's budgets at some point in after school programs and such. So, but I think I mean, and then there are the other things. There's inflation, there's salary and benefits, there's increased healthcare, and inflation hits everything. They're again, talking to business managers, they're not only having trouble getting teachers, but they're also having trouble getting bus drivers and substitutes and such. So there's some of them have raised their pay for that, trying to bring people in, which will be reflected in their budget also. And again, it's going to vary from area to area, but those are the things that I've been hearing.
I'm gonna keep on asking questions.
That's fine by me.
Folks planning, districts planning for both possibly less revenue coming into the ed fund, right? Like we're still a little bit in that bubble of federal spending, sales tax.
The road has been coming.
And people waiting implementation. I think I keep on asking you because I want you to say, yes, districts are planning for in the future for the people waiting implementation, and you're going to keep on saying no because that's reality. And so maybe I should stop asking.
Well, I think some of them probably are. They are looking ahead. Again, I have not come out with those FY24 numbers that are analogous to the FY24 equalized pupil numbers. I haven't come out with those yet because I'm still waiting to get information because people in our area have been on vacation too. But it is a question that is on my list to ask business managers next time around. I only ask them so many questions each time. But that is one of them because we are now getting to that point where they have done their budget. I know that we had a fairly large meeting back in early December, I think, with the school boards, the superintendent's association, and a lot of people coming in. We were talking about Act 173, the special education census block grant. We're talking about the waiting formulas, and what people were doing. It was organized by Jeff Francis of the School Boards Association, and that's one of the things we're talking about is kind of planning ahead. This is what you need to be aware of what's going to happen with the equalized pupils. Again, I think it was here last time, maybe it was not, but it's kind of like a bell curve. With most people, aren't going to see a huge change either way. But some people, as you start moving out from that central point, are going to see either large decreases or large increases. So they're the ones who are going to really have to be thinking about it. There is some relief in Act 127, 5-year relief, where their tax rate can be capped at 5% if they don't increase their spending by an absurd amount or something like that. So there are some built-in things that you guys did last year that will kind of help mitigate it, but give people a path to go and start working towards. It's not happening just like that without some thought, in terms of a soft landing, for lack of a better term.
And I think we were very careful to sort of build in protections for the impact on some districts.
Mm-hmm.
Thinking about sort of the impact on the ed fund as a whole, but I want to be.
Yeah.
I know that's something that we talked about. Just sort of, I want to make sure we don't forget the things that we talked about last year. So, thank you. Well, thanks for coming in.
My pleasure.
See you next week.
I'll be back. I don't know how to turn my computer on properly.
It wasn't you. It was not you.
Sometimes it is.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
I stopped your screen share, Brett.
Thank you. I saw that. Because I would have figured out half an hour later. Oh, yeah, I'm still sharing. I can listen to you.
Hi, Julia. Welcome.
Thank you.
So because of sort of some of the concerns that I just brought up to Brad about the transition to next year and some of, districts in some cases not being sort of ready to plan for that, I want to make sure we're planning for it a little bit. So I asked Julia in this education outlook to also for us to take a look at what it would look like if we set a tax rate offset reserve aside for next year from this year's revenues. And so that's, just if you see an extra column, it's because I asked Julia to add the column. So I'll turn it over to you now, Julia, to talk us through it.
Great, thank you. For the record, Julie Richter, Joint Fiscal Office. I'm going to share my screen. This committee for folks watching it, this outlook for folks watching at home is on the committee page. The construct is pretty similar to what we looked at last week. I do want to note before getting into the details of the columns that this education payment that we're seeing for fiscal year 24 still is the amount that was included in the governor's recommended budget and is not reflecting what we just looked at from Brad. So moving forward, because more budgets are coming in, we've got more data, that number will be updated, but the number we're looking at now still reflects GovRec. So what I have here in front of you is the outlook. So this FY 2023 projected column, this is the same as we looked at last week. The FY 2024 column, also the same as last week. This is only including the governor's recommended categorical aid changes for fiscal year 24, as well as the forecasted revenues that we're anticipating. Fiscal year 2024, this next column here, we also looked at this last week. This is the governor's recommended categorical aid and universal school meals now included. And lastly, we have in this final column, fiscal year 2024, the GovRec categorical aid, universal school meals, and a tax reserve, which is 50% of the revenues that are unreserved and unallocated. Madam Chair asked me to place into that tax reserve for the modeling. And all of the rest of the unreserved and unallocated funds we've used to lower the average tax bill across all three classes uniformly. So I'll just point out a few things to sort of help you walk through the difference in the three columns. We have included this line here, line F, the average percentage bill change compared to prior year. And this is based on the data that we're using currently in our model. It hasn't all been updated, but with all those caveats in mind, these are the average percentage bill changes across those three constructs.
Bless you.
The lines in purple, those are referencing the new policy changes that are on top of or in addition to the governor's recommend. So you can see how they sort of build out in these different constructs. And so I'll pause there. I'm happy to answer any questions that would be helpful for the committee.
Julie, I think I'm just missing something here. On the last column on the right, I guess I'm trying to figure out why that rate is lower than the one just to the left of it. Is it using the reserve or is it building in a reserve?
Oh, thank you. That is, let me double check. That is not the right average rate. All of the yields are, yeah, let me double check that and get back to you.
Should be a credit, right?
Sorry?
The offset reserve should be a credit.
So the offset reserve, yeah, so that's a mistake on my behalf in terms of putting in these numbers. I will update it and get the committee the right number there. But it's not using that tax rate offset reserve to lower the.
Right, it's building that.
It's sort of, it's a similar construct as the PCB reserve or as the OPEB reserve from a couple of years ago. So sort of putting that 50 million aside for next year or the future.
Revenue to add to the reserve.
Yeah, it's creating a new additional reserve. So for instance, in last year's yield bill, there was the PCB reserve that set up the 32 million, set it aside for the future policymakers to determine how to distribute those funds. This 50 million is the same.
And I guess what I'd say the difference between the PCB reserve and this reserve is that PCB reserve is actually designed to be spent very explicitly, whereas this reserve is designed to just be released next year to offset taxes next year.
Okay.
So it doesn't have, yeah.
So
Oh, sorry, Carl, I jumped
Sorry,
over Carl.
Julia, are the corresponding numbers in that column then all the way over on the right, are they also, I mean, it looks like that line item D, the yield per equalized pupil, it looks like that one might be correct, but the one above it, item C, does not look like, looks like that would also.
Yeah, I'm not sure why these numbers are plugged in the way that they are up here. So I'm going to politely ask to get back to you until I can speak with confidence on what the right numbers should be.
Thank you.
Should we maybe pause the whole conversation and pick it back up?
That would be helpful, yeah.
Okay, great.
Sorry about that.
It's okay. I'm sorry I didn't notice when I was coming through it. Okay. Let us transition to sports betting and we'll schedule this later today or tomorrow.
Okay.
Okay. Just let us know when you're ready.
I don't know how that happened.
Education team, you're welcome to hang out for sports betting, but we're,
You're all set.
sports wagering, excuse me.
None taken.
H-127.
We are gonna pick up H-127.
For artificial intelligence.
Next year.
Thanks for your help, Brad.
See you all later.
We're increasing tax rates.
Tucker, I think you're up.
I might not let Tucker know about the change.
That's okay. Tucker, we're trying out screen sharing in our committee for the first time, but we don't have to do it right now. But if you could please prompt us with page numbers, we would so much appreciate that so we don't get lost as we're scrolling around.
I will absolutely do that.
Thanks so much.
First, Tucker Anderson, Legislative Counsel. Second, I did not bring a device because I thought this was a committee that did not do screen sharing. So it was my great joy to not carry my laptop up here.
Well, I'm sorry to ruin it for you next time.
Next time, I will bring my digital device and be ready to share. You're going to take a look at H-127 today. I'm going to be working off of the version that was passed by House Government Operations, which was a strike all. And according to my notes, that's draft 2.1. The date should be 2/16/2023 at 7:35 p.m. That's version 2 at the bottom, if you see that. I'm going to start with a general introduction to the concept and what is laid out in the bill in its 30 points. The sports wagering bill, as it was passed out of House Government Operations, legalizes sports wagering throughout the state in one format, which is mobile sports wagering. Sports wagers placed over a mobile device. It authorizes a single entity to offer that sports wagering within the state. And that entity is the Department of Liquor and Lottery. Department of Liquor and Lottery is authorized to offer sports wagering, termed a sports book, through contracted entities. The bill sets up that a minimum of 2 and a maximum of 6 entities can be selected through a competitive bidding process. Contracts will be offered to those operators. The operators will then sell this product to the public at large, persons over 21 years of age. All right, so the bill sets out to establish a new 31 VSA Chapter 25, which is going to contain all of sports wagering. I'll start by pointing out a few definitions that will be important to this committee and your understanding of how the sports wagering chapter is structured.
Can I ask another question, sort of big picture about the bill?
Sure.
It also seems to do something with fantasy sports. Is that what it's called?
Yes,
Okay.
but that something
It's
is
like a whole separate thing.
very technical, which is that fantasy sports contests are already legal in
Yes.
Vermont. The fantasy sports contest chapter is currently kept in Title IX. Everything else having to do with wagering and the lottery is kept in Title 31. So one of the things this bill does, as it proposes to legalize sports wagering broadly, is to scoop up all of the existing provisions around fantasy sports contests and move them into the title where all the other wagering activities are kept.
But not change anything else in there.
It changes one thing.
Okay, great. Okay, cool. Thank you. I needed that context for a while. That stuff is floating around in there.
Do you want to know what that one thing is?
Sure.
That one thing is that right now fantasy sports contest operators register with the Secretary of State. And this changes that so that they will register instead with the Department of Liquor and Lottery.
Okay, I have questions about that, but I'll wait until we get there.
Starting with some of these definitions that you'll need to understand the chapter and in particular some of the monies that are involved in the bill. Touch first upon the very first definition listed. We're going to be on page 1. This is on line 12. And that's the definition of adjusted gross sports wagering revenue. It's defined as the sports wagering receipts, excluding any voided bets, the winnings that are paid out by the operator, and any federal excise tax. This is going to be used later on in just one subsection. And that's the subsection that describes how the operators during the competitive bidding process have to inform the department of what their anticipated revenue is going to be before they're selected as an agent. I will move along through some of the other definitions without reading them out to you so that we don't get too frustrated here. If you go to page 2, line 7, definition of operator, that's the party who is authorized by contract or agreement with the department to offer a sports book in the state. Some of the limitations you need to know that are built into these definitions for purposes of understanding what the market would be. There's an exhaustive definition of what a prohibited sports bettor is. These are persons who are not allowed to access sports wagering. That would include members or employees of the Department of Liquor and Lottery, principals or employees of the operators themselves, contractors of the department, amateur or professional athletes if the wager is based on the sport that they participate in, sports agents, owners, employees of teams, players, umpires, essentially anyone involved with the events that are going to be wagered on. Any individual placing a wager as a proxy for another person. And I wanted to point that out because there are some fun sports wagering terms that you may hear as you get into this. And this is one of them. There's this thing called bundling, and you bundle using beards. Beards go in with wagers for you and place bets on your behalf.
Beards? Like,
Yes.
okay.
Like you are covering your face.
Oh, cool.
So then any person under 21 years of age. Prohibited sports events. These are also limitations on the market itself. The prohibited sports event means any collegiate sports events in which one of the participants is a college that is primarily located in Vermont, unless the event falls within an exemption that covers tournaments. So you can place wagers on Vermont teams in tournaments, but not broadly. High school or collegiate sports events and any amateur or professional sports event where the participants are primarily under 18 years of age.
Yeah.
What's the basis of that we can't bet on UVM on a random Tuesday?
That was a policy choice that was made by the sponsors and then was confirmed by House Government Operations that they wanted to keep wagering separate from Vermont's in-state college events. And I would say that it's very common. There are only a couple of states out of the 30 plus states that have legalized sports wagering that allow wagering on in-state college athletics.
Oh, interesting. Because it influence maybe? Personal influence?
I'm not certain. There's a lot of research about how wagering impacts in specific college age men. And that is one age and demographic that is prone to gambling addiction, at least according to the research that I saw through this process.
Does that mean under any circumstances, like if they're in a national contest, that you still can't bet on Vermont, but could we bet on Kansas?
That was one of the exceptions that I pointed out, that you will be able to bet on the tournament games.
Okay, sorry, I missed it.
I wanted to point out on page 4.
Sorry, we have one more question.
Sorry.
Page 2, definition 7, mobile sports wagering platform. the end of that sentence has "or the internet," and I'm not sure how that fits in. Because it makes it sound as if I had a room and I used a combination of hardware, software, and data networks and the internet, then I could accept sport bets. What makes it mobile sports wagering as opposed to non-mobile?
So that clause is meant to extend this to wagering that is placed through mobile devices or the internet, which would also include a desktop device like the computer you have in front of you. And I can go back through and see if we need to untangle those clauses to make it clear that that is connected to the actual placement of the wager rather than the control
Exactly.
of the placement of the wager.
Yeah.
So I'll take a look at that.
That was my concern. Thank you.
My pleasure. All right. Moving along at high speed. On page 4, on line 6, I wanted to point out that the definition of sports event means events at which 2 or more persons are participating in an athletic event, and it also includes horse racing and equestrian events.
But not cars.
Not expressly, however,
What if there are people in cars?
correct.
There just might not be people on the horses.
Something like a racing event may qualify as an event at which 2 or more persons participate in a sports or athletic event. So I believe that in many other states, stock car racing, as an example, would fall under a sports or athletic event at which 2 or more persons are participating. But not someone trying to break the land speed record because they would be driving all by their lonesome.
Yes,
Not dog racing.
Not expressly included, and you would not have the requisite number of persons participating.
Okay.
Although I definitely consider my dogs to be persons. Sports wagering. Definition: wagering on sporting events or any portion of sporting events or individual performance statistics of those that are participating in the sporting events. So an example of that is betting on a quarterback to pass for a certain number of yards during an event. There's an exhaustive list in subdivision 15 sub C that describes some of the types of bets that are included here. This is another example of the universe of language around sports betting. And sports wagering includes single game bets, teaser bets, parlays, over-under bets, money line bets, pools, exchange wagering, in-game wagering.
Where are these?
This is on page 5 on line 3. And it's the list of types of bets. Something to note for later on is that before an event or a type of wager can be offered to the public, at least under the structure of this bill, the Department of Liquor and Lottery has to approve the events and the type of wager before it can be offered. All right, moving into some of the duties of the department.
Wait a minute. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, but that same sports wagering says subdivision 16.
Good catch.
Thank you.
When we made adjusted,
Good.
we had to adjust subdivision 1. It used to be gross sports wagering revenue, and I didn't correct all of the cross references clearly. So I will note that technical correction. Thank you for your laser focus.
Representative Maslin.
Yeah, maybe you expressed it, Tucker, but I missed, exchange wagering is what?
Fantastic question. I would have to have my glossary at hand, but I did not bring my device.
That's okay, I don't figure it out.
Perhaps the commissioner can explain it to us when she comes up,
Okay, great.
because she has a device. Back to you, Tucker.
We're going to move into section 1302. And this is where we start to get into some of the structure of sports wagering in the bill. This is going to be the duties of the Department of Liquor and Lottery. By and large, the department is the authorized entity. It's going to be operating the sports books through their contracted entities. Subdivision B1 of that section, which is on line 14 of page 5, the commissioner is granted authority to negotiate and contract to authorize a minimum of 2, but not more than 6 operators to operate a sports book in the state. Subdivision 2 of that section clarifies that if there are unqualified entities that apply, that the commissioner would not be compelled to still admit 2, but instead would be able to say, we're not doing this at all, or we'll only go with 1. And I am moving on to page 6. There are a series of duties that the department has as the entity that's going to be offering this. That includes providing age verification, identity verification, what's known as geofencing, which is ensuring that the people who are wagering are actually in the state. Wager limitations, statewide voluntary self-exclusion program. Touching on that very briefly, these are program lists where an individual will tell the department or an operator that they would like to be excluded from wagering irrevocably for a period of time. Could be a week, could be a month, could be forever. Take me off the list. I can't play this. I don't want to play this again. Keep me away. They also have to provide, and we're on page 7 now, security mechanisms to ensure the confidentiality of wagering and financial information, and measures to ensure that wagers are not placed by a prohibited sports bettor. We might just call that last one integrity monitoring. It's kind of making sure that prohibited entities are not participating in sports wagering because it threatens the integrity of the wagering pool and potentially the sports events themselves. Subsection D of this section, we're on page 7, there's this mechanism built into the bill where the department can receive a notice from the governing body of a sports event where they say, please don't allow betting on this particular event or series of events because we've detected irregularities or it might threaten the integrity of the game. And the department has the ability to kind of close those events to wagering.
Representative Taylor?
Is that use of college as opposed, is that a term of art that includes universities?
Yes.
Okay.
Although throughout the bill, I would say that it could be tightened up just by saying post-secondary institutions, but this isn't exclusive to just what we call them in Vermont. So the terms are left somewhat broad in here because this could be, in the previous example, Kansas University reaching out to say, don't allow wagering on our university game in this event because we've detected some sort of bundling scheme throughout the states where individual bettors are placing $2,500 bets, but we're noticing that it's all happening at the same time. And in the aggregate, it's a $25 million bet that's very strange. So shut it down.
Okay.
Okay, we already touched upon the power to approve types of wagers and categories of sporting events. That's in subsection E. All right, subsection G on page 8. This requires the department to include in its contract with its operators a provision that prohibits the use of advertising, logos, and branding on materials that are intended for persons under 21 years of age. All right, now let's talk about rulemaking. Section 1303, page 8, line 8 is where this starts. The department, through the Board of Liquor and Lottery, is...
Actually, I have a question about the last one. Intended primarily for persons under 21 years of age. I feel like, is that defined differently for different sins?
Perhaps. Now, there was a question about this in House Government Operations. Is this specific enough? Do we actually know what we're talking about here? Is the department going to be able to articulate it?
And I'm not sure I care. I'm just
Yeah.
want to understand that a little bit better.
The example I gave is that there are some products that are very clearly marketed for persons under 21. Baby outfits might be one of them. And then there are others that are a little less easy to articulate whether they're intended for persons under 21, which might be like an adult-sized T-shirt, right? And somewhere in the gulf between those two things, we have a gray area, but this is going to be for the department to include in its contract with the entity. So it's clear to both parties, you are not allowed to sell baby toys that have your brand's logo plastered on them.
How does this with interstate commerce? I mean, I watch ESPN sporting events all the time, and there are DraftKings. I mean, they're advertising nationally, regionally. How do we have the ability to get in there and we have the ability?
This subsection doesn't reach advertising broadly, just advertising on specific products. So material products, and this is
Material.
right, part of the agreement that the individual operator is going to have with.
So T-shirts, water bottles, stuff.
Right.
Okay.
So the cost of doing business with the state in this case is that the state is not going to condone the sale of products specifically in Vermont that bear these brands that are intended for persons under 21.
It would, okay, all right, thank you.
May I ask you so if you, I mean, this is a bad example, but like cigarettes or whatever, where you have to be over the age of 18, but not necessarily 21. Like, I think there's some products that kind of get in that weird, like, where is adulthood?
Do you have to be 21 for
You have to be
cigarettes?
21 in
Yeah.
Vermont.
Do you really?
They changed the law a
Okay.
few years ago.
I haven't smoked cigarettes in a long time. Continue, sorry.
No, your example, I mean, but it's still a good example.
I mean, I don't even, now I'm like trying to think of a product that is just 18 though.
Lottery tickets, right? There's
Some firearms, I think,
great.
and yeah.
So
Do you understand the nature of my question? Could you give it? I'm not so sure.
I think it's still captured by my prior response that there are some things that are obviously, some products that are obviously intended for children, and then some that are obviously intended for persons over 21 years of age. And it's the gray area in between that's likely going to be sticky here.
Okay.
Right. But again, this is something that the parties are going to agree to as part of their contract.
Thank you.
back to you.
Thank you. All right, so procedures. The Board of Liquor and Lottery is granted authority to adopt procedures to govern the establishment and operation of any sports book. Procedures are adopted pursuant to the Administrative Procedures Act, 3 VSA Section 835. They are different from rules. They have different requirements. Typically, they are directed internally to guide some sort of internal process. In this case, it's the design of the contract with the sports betting operator. However, very similar to the multi-jurisdictional lottery provisions, this does allow the board to adopt these procedures and for those procedures to have the force of law. The exact same language is baked into the lottery statutes. Those procedures, starting on page 9, they have to adopt the following minimum standards for the department's operators, and I'll touch on the categories unless you want to get into some of the minutia. The categories are minimum computer system security, sports wagering system requirements that meet or exceed national standards, minimum house rules. Moving on to page 9.
Yes.
Line 4, 1A. Documented system security testing performed by a licensed, does that mean licensed to be a security testing?
Yes.
There are such licenses, I guess, okay. Down on line 11F, integration with an independent control system. I don't know what that means, to ensure integrity of system wagering information. So they have to have a third, two systems looking at the integrity of the system wagering information. Integrate with, how independent does that have to be? What makes it independent, I guess, is my question.
It will likely also fall under these third-party auditing services, which do exist. And there's currently at least one provision that requires third-party auditing for fantasy sports contest operators in the state of Vermont. And I can find out for you what those requirements are now and how they come into play. I can also look into each one of these requirements is borrowed from one of the other 30 some odd states that have adopted similar standards. So I can find out, do a little research.
No, as long as it makes sense to you.
What are those? Well, I will not be enforcing any of this. So. Make sure it makes sense to you all.
Yeah.
As the arguments here.
Well,
Actually, also don't enforce the law in here.
That's true.
you said makes sense, so I'm all right with that. Okay.
Page 10, minimum accounting controls. And I'm still moving through the subdivisions without getting into a lot of the detail. Minimum internal control standards, minimum cash reserves, and promotional play requirements. And if you go through some of those subdivisions in Romanets, you'll note that there are very specific consumer protection controls built into this around promotional play, which is the offering of free bets and similar promotional tokens. If we're comfortable, I'll move on to page 11 and I'll move into section 1304. It's the first time you're hearing the term revenue outside of the definition section.
We're all very excited.
I can tell, yes. So this states that the revenue received by the department from sports wagering, less administrative costs in the amount due to the problem gambling special fund, which we'll get to later, it's a teaser, shall be deposited into the general fund. So proceeds to the general fund. Section 1305, confidentiality of records. This governs any records produced or acquired by the department pursuant to this chapter and requires the department to keep the following confidential and exempt from the Public Records Act: personal information and background check documents, lists of names, including information related to voluntary self-exclusion. So if you add yourself to the self-exclusion list, there's no risk that the department is going to release that information to the public. Trade secrets, business records, financial records, and related information, and records relating to operator security, technology, facilities, or systems. All right.
Yeah.
Is that background check documents, are they available to the person whose background was checked?
They would be, yes, since that person will be likely either supplying or authorizing it. And I will need to check on this again. You've given me a lot to research, but I believe that in some of the Title 20 provisions around default requirements for background checks, that the individual who's submitting to the background check has access to them. Now, the background checks are conducted by state entities, but also through the FBI. And I can look into the extent to which the individual who's consenting to the background check.
I just have a vague memory of something in the other committee that I was with. They were talking about background checks and the whole process of how a person whose background check is made and they disagree with it, or the decision was made, and they needed a system of appealing, a way of seeing the records and things like that. But, okay. I guess if they actually, it depends on who submits them.
Well, Under this structure, they would not be capable of getting it through the Department of Liquor and Lottery through a Public Records Act request. It doesn't foreclose other processes for accessing that information, just accessing it under the PRA.
Okay.
Representative Anthony.
That triggers, and maybe not, it's a policy issue admittedly, but how would a statute that authorizes the Department of Liquor and Lottery to oversee this not speak to the internal confidentiality expectations of folks who were guarding the guarding the process internal to the DLC?
So you're asking why there aren't confidentiality provisions governing how DLL staff, officers, what have you, handle this information?
Unless that's somewhere else.
There are overarching provisions in Vermont statute dealing with things like confidential data, data brokering, things like that. I cannot recall if there is still a provision around the inadvertent disclosure of protected information. But I am certain that with respect to background checks and social security numbers, that there are federal requirements around the disclosure of that information and inadvertent disclosure of that information.
And does this provision include business application information? Sort of bidding information?
It would, provided that it falls under trade secrets, business records, financial records, and related information.
It strikes me as quite broad. Pretty much anything would fall under that.
It is very broad, yes.
Thank you. On to exemptions.
This is interesting, at least to my legal brain. So I do not think that this is strictly necessary. Right now, wagering is a crime. So this exemption essentially says that everything that's authorized in this chapter, both sports wagering and the already legal fantasy sports contests, are not criminal activities. I don't think it's necessary because it expressly authorizes all of these activities and says that it's okay. But when the fantasy sports contest operator statutes were put in place, this provision was put in there. And there's some fear that because past General Assembly said we have to make sure that we exempt this criminal statute, we should continue to do that so that it doesn't seem like we are not making this legal. I used a lot of double negatives there, but this is essentially saying that the criminal statutes do not apply to sports wagering broadly.
Is this what we call belts and suspenders?
Absolutely. Yes. I typically only wear one at a time, which is why I would not have necessarily put this in the first place, but here we are. All right. So subchapter 2, we're now shifting away from the department and towards the operators. These are the companies that are going to be offering sports wagering to the public. We're on page 12 to bring everybody up to speed. We're going to be working from line 12 down, starting with section 1320. This outlines the competitive bidding process as it relates to the sports wagering operators. By and large, the commissioner, stated in subsection A, is going to select operators through a competitive bidding process. Subsection B, the Board of Liquor and Lottery is required to adopt procedures to establish the criteria for the selection of the state's operators. The minimum guidelines that H127 requires, and I'll move through them at a slow pace in case there are any harumps or requests that I stop. Subdivision 1, an estimate of the applicant's potential adjusted gross sports wagering revenue and the percentage of that revenue that the mobile sports from mobile sports wagering that the applicant will pay to the state. So they have to give an estimate of what their adjusted gross sports wagering revenue is and how much they're willing to share.
And we define revenue very explicitly at the top.
In the definitions, yes. It is all gross revenue minus voided bets, federal excise tax, and winnings paid out to the participants. Subdivision 2, the number of individually branded websites the operator proposes to use. These are broadly referred to as skins, and this is a company may have multiple brands that they put on differing websites or mobile applications to offer sports wagering to the public. Skins is a video game term that refers to when you swap out how your character looks. And in the wagering industry, it applies to both physical locations and how you label your mobile application for purposes of branding it to the public.
So the commissioner could authorize 2 companies, but it would appear to the public as if there were 50 companies.
It could.
The average member of the public.
If that's how the department determines it's going to go about doing business with the operators.
Okay.
Next, the applicant has to provide its responsible gaming plan and a description of its responsible gaming safeguards. A list of all jurisdictions where the applicant and any parent companies are currently authorized to conduct sports wagering. The applicant's player acquisition model, which includes advertising, its marketing budget, details on how the applicant will convert customers from wagering through illegal channels to wagering legally in the state. In the sports wagering world, this is the liquidity of the market. How much of the illegal market can you convert to the legal taxable market? And what is your plan to make that happen? The estimated time frame for implementing the applicant's sports wagering operations. I'll give you another term of art to throw out there from time to time. This is called speed to market. How quickly can you stand up the market in the state?
That's a term that's used much more broadly.
Great.
That's nice. Great.
You understand something?
The applicant's integrity monitoring systems and the applicant's plan for maximizing sustainable long-term revenue for the state, including a detailed market analysis. All of these requirements, minimum requirements for the bidding process, are very similar to what was established in New York State, and a few of these are borrowed from what happened in New Hampshire.
So that says that one of our goals is to work with folks who maximize long-term revenue for the state?
It is a
goal of doing this?
It is a minimum criteria.
Okay.
In New Hampshire, it was the final selection criteria. After all the other requirements for how the competitive bidding process was carried out, the operators that were selected were based on those that maximized revenue to the state.
And these operators, there are at least 2 of them, but not more than 6.
That is correct, under the current formula.
Wow. That's a lot of money.
Maybe.
Maybe. I can neither confirm nor deny. I'm on the OLC, not the JFO side.
The money, and we can talk through the implications of some of that with the commissioner other than with.
Yes, right. My mistake. Thank you
No,
very
no, no.
much for your answer.
The dollar question too, the prioritization, I think is an interesting conversation to have with the commissioner.
Yeah.
In subsection C,
Yeah.
These are the criteria for the bidding. So what happens, so the client acquisition model. So they describe their client acquisition model. The state says, yeah, that looks good. They're accepted. What happens if they want to change it, or does this become part of a contract? If they want to change their client acquisition model, I presume they have to clear it with somebody.
only if it's built into the contract that DLL offers to the operator. And there may be components of player acquisition that DLL does want to include in its contract. So something that the Sports Betting Study Committee heard from the New Hampshire commissioner, and you can go back and listen to some of the testimony, is that they had specific restrictions around player acquisition, advertising, and materials, where only a certain amount of spending was allowed, potentially, I think was one of the criteria, or that advertising was only allowed in certain spaces.
Okay. So when all these are done, a contract is made up, and that could specify those sorts of things. Good. Okay. Got it.
Representative Anthony.
Thank you. I see, I'm getting a little ahead.
Please don't get ahead. Don't get ahead.
What's that?
Don't get ahead.
Don't get ahead.
Don't get ahead.
Okay,
Thank you. Let's stay where we are and then we can get ahead. when we get
Okay.
there. Okay. C,
C,
Tucker.
this is a fee. C is a fee. So C requires the department to assess an annual operator fee of $550,000. That is going to be apportioned equally among the authorized operators.
What does that mean exactly?
That means that if there are two operators, each operator is going to pay 1/2 of the $550,000 fee. Something similar happened in New York State, where New York had a statewide annual operator fee. And I always use this number, and I can't remember if it's a figment of my imagination or if it's the actual number. So my apologies if it's not the exact figure, but it's something in the ballpark of $25 million in New York that gets apportioned among their 9 operators.
Gosh.
This is a
Seems
detail.
Equally portioned?
Well,
Okay.
because they're not gonna get that kind of revenue.
And we can discuss the size of the fee and whether it will cover costs with the commissioner when she comes up. Representative Demrow, Representative Sims.
Tucker, portion based on the number of operators or the revenue generated by the number of operators?
The intent of the language, as I understand it, is the number of operators.
So if there's 5 operators, you can
Right.
pay 110,000.
So the term equally among the authorized operators. That's how it's used.
Sims.
And when folks put in their competitive bid, are they aware of the total number of operators that there will be and what portion of that fee will be theirs? Or you put your bid in not knowing whether you'll be the sole, I guess you get a higher proportion of revenue.
Tucker, you get the most excited face when someone asks a question that you've been looking forward to.
Yes, this is a really fascinating part of the competitive bidding process. In the other states that have gone through this sort of competitive bidding selection for operators, what they ask the operators to do is actually establish tables. And in those tables, it is this number of operators, this expected limitation on who can wager and what the wagers are going to be. And then the operator, through some sort of proprietary method, would estimate, for example, this is how much revenue we can give you if there's 2 operators, 3 operators, 4 operators, 5 operators, and then is it retail? Is it mobile? Is it a combination of both? And I can send you, because I have it readily available in the 2021 to 2022 Office of Legislative Counsel and Joint Fiscal Office report on sports wagering, links to the competitive bidding materials from New Hampshire and New York so that you can see how those tables are structured. And I will note that, to your point about a criteria of the selection process being maximizing revenue to the state, that in both of those instances, points are awarded depending on what your bid is for the contract. And typically one of the biggest point categories is how much can you share with the state? What is your maximum revenue share under these sets of circumstances, including if we admit 6 versus 2.
But that seems different from the fee.
It is. The fee's taken into account.
But what I'm hearing saying is as a part of their bid, the companies are gaming out all the different scenarios. That sounds like a very complicated competitive bid process, but it sounds like they've done it in other states and they can do it here.
And they'll be able to assess, of course, how much they would pay under each one of those scenarios, because they'll know that the fee goes down, but so does their potential share of the market.
It was interesting how you described the maximizing revenue as how much of their total revenue are they sharing with the state or not. I guess I see that as one definition of maximizing revenue. I guess the other would be how effective are you at marketing, not by putting logos on baby clothes, but through, part of the way that we can maximize revenue is by having a higher share of the earnings. Also, companies may have different strategies to grow the market and have more Vermonters participating in it.
Yes, and that's covered in 2 of the minimum criteria as well. How are you going to grow the market? What are your strategies for increasing the liquidity? And they also are required, at least under this, to submit a detailed market analysis. And one of the things that absolutely comes into consideration is for the operators when they're putting this together is what's the portability of our product in this market? Are there other states in the area where there may already be users that as they're in Vermont or passing through Vermont will be capable of using this product? You know, how broad is the population of users, maybe beyond just Vermont residents? Anybody who's in Vermont.
I guess it seems a little at odds with the other criteria, which around
let's-
responsible gaming. Okay.
Let's talk about the criteria with the commissioner, and then we'll also better understand some of the revenue modeling with joint fiscal when they come in.
And I'm
Andrews.
gonna withdraw, I think I was on the same page.
I just want to make sure we get through the whole bill and get to hear from the commissioner before 3:30.
We're halfway there and the last half moves fast. So
Don't jinx us there. But-
subsection D, we're on page 14, line 1. This is the general requirement that each operator pays the department a revenue share that is determined through the competitive bidding process. All right. I'm going to move through the prohibited activities. In general, what you need to know is that the department's operators are prohibited from participating in sports wagering. There's an unfair advantage there. The department and its operators are given permission to participate in national and international monitoring services, which do exist, Representative Taylor, and that the commissioner has the authority to restrict, limit, or exclude sports wagering if they get information from these services that would require them to shut down wagering on a particular event. The department is granted access to the financial and compliance reports of its operators. And we're on to page 15 now. The department retains compliance oversight over its operators. Section 1325.
Yes, Representative Anthony.
And here's where I was going with my other curiosity.
I'm glad we got here.
Yes. I quickly read the compliance, but I was using it to refer back to the how do we pick you section, that is to say, the criteria, and wondering whether there's some kind of mechanism in here other than going to court where you, the successful operator in the initial round, have failed to perform in a way that's satisfactory and consequently you're out of the pool. Or have I not got there to a section like that? I mean, aside from compliance with the rules, I would think that there's a compliance with the set of objectives, the basis of which you were chosen. And if you have failed to maintain the prospects that you put forward, shouldn't there be some way to switch horses along the way for the commissioner to say, your proposal was great on paper, but you failed to fulfill your prognosis?
That would be within the 4 corners of the contract.
Okay.
That's executed between.
And the contract would definitely, to be a contract, had to have an expiration date.
Yes.
Okay.
Unless, well, yes.
Okay. Cool.
I was about to say unless this is going to be an indefinite franchise, but.
No, I
not
don't
sure.
think so.
That would be the intent here.
Statute of frauds.
That is correct. Crimes and penalties, not Dostoevsky. So the crimes and penalties provisions here, a person who violates these provisions, the first time it's $10,000 or imprisoned for not more than 6 months. Second offense, $25,000 or a year. And third offense, $50,000 or not more than 2 years. And largely what we're covering with this are the illegal operators in the state. So entities that are offering illegal wagering and have not been authorized to offer wagering through the department.
And the Judiciary Committee is going to spend a moment on this because it is the creation of a new crime essentially.
We can move through a couple pages really quickly here. If I tell you that fantasy sports contests exist, they are currently regulated overseen by the Attorney General. Fantasy sports contest operators are registered with the Secretary of State. Subchapter 3, which is on page 16, takes all of the existing provisions, moves it into Title 31, with the exception of shifting registration from the Secretary of State to the Department of Liquor and Lottery.
Tucker, do they pay a fee when they register with the Secretary of State?
They do. They pay a $5,000 fee.
And we're keeping that same fee, so it's going to a different department.
Yes.
What page is that on?
The $5,000 fee is on page 23. It's under section 1333 registration, which starts on page 22. I'll move on to subchapter 4. We are on page 23 now, line 10. This is the subchapter that deals with responsible gaming and problem gambling. Section 1340 establishes the responsible gaming plan in subsection A. Each operator has to submit an annual plan to the Department of Liquor and Lottery and the Department of Mental Health. It's a prerequisite requirement before the operator can be authorized to operate in the state, is that they have to submit this plan. Moving on to page 24, at least every 5 years, the operators have to have their responsible gaming plan reviewed by an independent entity, and the department may require the operator to pay for that independent review. In subsection C, there is an annual requirement that the Department of Liquor and Lottery, in consultation with the Department of Mental Health, submit a report to the General Assembly on the impact of sports wagering on problem gambling in Vermont, including a demographic analysis. And the department may again require, through its contract, for the operators to pay for the costs associated with preparing that report to the General Assembly.
And I just want to flag that for the committee that I think generally saying a department may require a private company to pay for something, but not being clear about what those costs associated may be or whether or not they will is bigger than I usually feel comfortable with in statute, because I think it's important that if we are going to serve a regulatory function, it's a reliable regulatory function. Back to you.
Subsection D, we're on line 13, page 24. The department has to make sure that each one of the operators meets some minimum responsible gaming requirements with their platform. The platform has to be able to prohibit individuals from establishing multiple accounts, from using credit cards to establish accounts, or for placing wagers. The platform has to allow a person to limit the amount of money that can be deposited in the account. The platform has to establish a statewide voluntary exclusion process that allows a person to exclude themselves, as we discussed before. We're on page 25 now. It has to provide responsible gaming and problem gambling information to participants and conspicuously display on each applicable internet or website application links to resources, periodic pop-up messages displaying the amount of time an individual has spent, means to initiate a break and play, and a clear display of the amount of money available to an individual in their account. Subsection E contains some advertising restrictions. So we're going to move from page 25 and 26. Sports wagering advertisements shall not depict any individual under 21 years of age, except for live footage or images of athletes and sporting events. They can't depict any individual under 21 in any way that may be construed as the underage individual participating in sports wagering or targeting individuals under 21 years of age. Subsection F is a restriction on post-secondary schools and their campuses. So first, it prevents post-secondary schools located in this state from permitting sports wagering to be advertised on property belonging to the school. Second, it prohibits an operator from advertising in a manner that targets the area of a college or university campus. There's a proviso in there that this doesn't cover generally available advertisements.
Representative Sims.
Sorry that Representative Harris isn't here anymore. Was there any committee conversation about promotion of betting on the House floor? I don't want us to limit
Like March
Rep.
Madness.
Harrison's March Madness side hustle.
No comment.
Ask him that
Better.
I think this will put Harrison out of business.
Yeah, do we have cause for concern? Or are we ecstatic about that?
All right.
That'll be my one amendment.
Tucker, where are we?
We're on the problem gambling special fund. Money. All right. Money. Page 26, line 15. This establishes the problem gambling special fund and requires the following amounts to be contributed annually from the sports wagering revenue received by the department. Subdivision 1 for fiscal year 2024, 5% of that revenue, but not less than $250,000. Subdivision 2 for 2025 and each year thereafter, 5%, but not less than $500,000.
What if sports wagering happens to not bring in very much revenue and does not even bring in $500,000? Where does that $500,000 for the special fund come from?
Great
Shall I
question.
ask joint fiscal that question tomorrow?
You should ask joint fiscal question. I will flag that that was an issue in the first year for the state of Wyoming, which had a $300,000 minimum appropriation. And at least in some of the initial reports we saw was struggling to get to that minimum threshold.
Thank you.
The funds are available to DMH for broadly problem gambling and responsible gaming programming. It's more focused on problem gambling assistance than it is the responsible gaming tools that were previously described. So providing support to certain agencies, promoting public awareness, establishing and funding programs to certify addiction counselors, and funding a helpline with text messaging and online chat capabilities. All right, subsection C, this is the reporting element built within this fund. On or before January 15th of each year, DMH is required to submit a report to the General Assembly that summarizes the programs and activities supported by the expenditures from the fund. Okay, section 2 of the bill. We're out of the sports wagering chapter. We are done with the sports wagering chapter. Section 2 requires a report from the Department of Liquor and Lottery on or before next January 15th concerning fantasy sports contests, the current kind of regulatory regime, some information about fantasy sports contest wagering that's happening in the state, and recommendations for how the current statutes may be amended to address any issues that they identify as they're carrying out the study.
I don't know anything about any of these things. Just on that as we enter this conversation. Are people already wagering on fantasy sports in Vermont?
Yes.
Maybe some people at this table.
No.
Okay.
No, but my friends do.
Okay, so we're already wagering on fantasy sports, and it's this wagering on real life sports that is somehow more problematic that we are addressing in this bill.
The universe of sports wagering is much larger than fantasy sports contests,
Right.
which are, well, I won't say narrowly defined, but they're defined in Title IX based on they're a game of skill, at least under those definitions in Title IX, where an individual is managing players on a fantasy sports team.
Yes, my teenager explained this part to me last night. So
Placing
but then that's, the wagering on that's already legal and it's the
Correct.
wagering on the real life sports that we are now addressing here.
Right, or individual statistics or.
Representative Beck.
Was there, in any of the conversations in GovOps or anywhere else, was there any conversation about other states that had done fantasy sports and then moved into real sports? And when you move into real sports, does that cannibalize your fantasy sports, or do people continue to, they take anything?
No, there was not that sort of discussion. The only points of discussion that touched on that a little was that I brought up that in a handful of the states, they set aside fantasy sports contests as its complete own thing and didn't really do any work with it, which is what's happening here.
And JFO question, not really you, but we don't make any money off of fantasy sports beyond this registration fee,
There's no tax applied to fantasy sports contest revenue.
except for just sort of the corporate tax for profits, but it's not revenue tax.
Or any
Net.
income
Okay.
earned by the players who may win.
Thanks. Congratulations and thank you.
Thank you all for your patience. I hope that was helpful. And
Thankful.
And fantasy sports doesn't put anything into a fund for gambling addiction.
that is correct.
Yeah, like, I'm sorry, like my level of what these things are is about zero. Why are they, I think I understand that one is about betting on real and one is about betting on fake, but like, it seems like why are they not all together now that we're doing it
I
all?
don't know if Tucker's the person to answer the
Okay.
question.
Yeah, that was a policy choice.
Yeah.
And we can have a reporter from GovOps talk about GovOps intent. If that would be helpful to folks as well. Thank you, Tucker. Commissioner Knight, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I believe this is your first time in the committee this year.
Yes, it is.
I would love to no, I don't know.
Welcome.
Yeah.
Glad to have you.
I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah.
So, for the record, Wendy Knight, I'm the commissioner of the Department of the what department do I work for? Liquor and Lottery. I was also the chair of the Sports Betting Study Committee, so I might talk about a little of the Sports Betting Study Committee.
Thank you. And Representative Odie was on.
Yes, she was.
She is not going
Yes,
to be here
I
today.
know.
She'll be back tomorrow, but.
So if I may, we have 40 minutes, right? I know you have lots of questions. I'm happy to come back anytime. I would like to kind of start high level if I may, just to give a little bit of overview, and then I'll try to answer some of the questions that I heard you ask without getting too much in the weeds. The question was about exchange wagering. The definition, one of the definitions is a marketplace that allows bettors to wager against each other at lower fees than the offered by a traditional sports book. Okay, so.
Big picture though.
Yes, big picture, coming up here.
Right.
So the goal for legalizing sports betting, according to the study committee, right, we met over the fall, was not only to capture revenue. There were four primary goals or state interests that the sports betting study committee determined. One was capture state revenues, because we know right now we're losing state revenues because Vermonters are crossing state lines to bet legally in sports and states that have legal sports books, or they are betting illegally, which has a lot of dangerous implications. The second was to ensure consumer protections and to build in a regulatory framework and the revenue for problem gambling, right? We wanted to address responsible gaming, consumer protections, and problem gambling. And that's where the whole intersection of fantasy sports came in, because the Sports Betting Study Committee had recommended that we use the criteria for consumer protections that exist for fantasy sports as the floor for the consumer protections that would exist for sports betting. We have an illicit market, so we want to make sure that we're the barriers to entry to a regulatory market are low, right? We're trying to bring an illicit market into a legal regulated market, much like we did with cannabis. And so that becomes a priority in terms of those policy decisions to make sure that you're not making it the barrier to entry, either by a player or an operator, so high that people are just going to stay in the illicit market. So that was a consideration as well. And then we wanted the ability for the primary regulatory body, the Department of Liquor and Lottery, to have a lot of flexibility and to be responsive. It's a very new market. We know that with the Supreme Court decision in 2018, that's when the states were allowed to decide whether to legalize sports betting. So it's very fluid, and the feeling was that you really needed to give the regulatory agency that flexibility to be responsive to the market. I think you were talking about when things change, right? You put it in the contract and you do it through a competitive bid process. So to put it into context, we know from the testimony with GeoComply, a company that does the geofencing, that right now thousands of Vermonters are attempting to access legal sports betting in other states. So that's the activities going on. And the point of regulating sports betting is to put some parameters around it and guardrails, much like we're regulating liquor and tobacco and marijuana. There was a study in the American Gaming Association that right last year, $63.8 billion are bet in the illegal market. That means it's
In the world?
No, in this country.
In 1 year.
Yep. So that means that the states collectively are losing $13.3 billion. So again, the reason that we want to, this exists, we want to regulate it to put those structures in place. When we, another study to point out, and I can send this to you, is that the Pew Research Center released a study in the fall, and for the past year, so it was from fall 2022 to fall 2021, they surveyed several Americans, and 19% had indicated that they were betting within the last year on sports. Most of them are betting with friends and families, like you mentioned, Representative Harrison, right? 6% of those are betting online. So while we see that states are making considerable amounts of money that have legalized it, I'm just giving you the context of people that are saying they're engaging in this. And again, most Americans, according to the survey, are continuing to bet with their family and friends. When we talk about the revenue share versus the tax rate, and this was a conversation in last year when we were talking about it in Senate Economic Development, it's a topic that was discussed in the Senate Sports Betting Study Committee, and then the recent testimony in the House is the choice is not, do we put a tax rate in statute, right? Or do we allow a revenue share? The choice really is, do you put a low tax rate in statute, or do you allow the ability to negotiate higher tax rate and a higher revenue share? So I just want to really be clear about the choice, because the study committee and the House Government Ops Military Affairs Committee decided it was better to allow the Department of Liquor and Lottery to negotiate that revenue share through a competitive bid process, because you have the ability to negotiate something other than 20%. The operators, and you'll hear from them, and you can, listen to the testimony, they want to have a tax rate in statute, but only if it's a certain amount. They're not willing to agree to a 50% tax rate. They're not willing to agree to a 35% tax rate. They'll agree to maybe a 15% tax rate or a 7% tax rate or a 20% tax rate, which are most of the states that have tax rates in statute permit. A revenue share gives you the ability to negotiate beyond that 20%.
Do you see that line about maximizing revenue as the revenue sharing agreement?
Yeah, so when
The reason it's described here as maximizing revenue as opposed to, competitive revenue sharing
So maximize revenue, that's a term that we're asking the operators, basically how much they're willing to share, right, with the state. And so that's one of the considerations that we would give in the competitive bid process, is looking at, and the way that Tucker described it is a matrix, but essentially, basically, we would be saying is, if we were to choose 2 operators, what would you offer the state as a revenue share? If we were to select 3, what would you choose as a revenue share? And that's what New Hampshire had done, and ultimately decided to select 1 because they could get 51%.
I guess I think I'm feeling a little stuck about, I guess I could see another way to interpret the idea of maximize revenue is like, how the heck can you grow this market into an enormous thing so that we're all, the state and the operator, that one way to respond to that would be to, have a high revenue sharing agreement with the state. Another would be to say, we're going to grow this market exponentially more than another competitor. And even though the revenue sharing might be less as a percent, the net would be higher to the state because they've been able to expand the market. Am I making any sense?
I think it feels to me like a little bit like semantics, right? So I feel like it might be a question to ask the operators how they feel about that, but I'm saying that we're trying to make sure in the negotiating process and the competitive bid process that the state gets the maximum share of the wagering revenue.
So can I ask a question too,
Yeah.
that I think might help me understand this a little bit better? So how would you define the difference between a tax rate and a negotiated revenue at the end of the day?
It's the same thing, Jim.
It's just that a tax rate you set in statute and a negotiated revenue you negotiate.
Correct.
At the end of the day, they'll both function the same way a tax rate.
Correct.
Thank you.
I asked JFO that last year and they confirmed that it's the same thing.
I also
Yeah.
did that, and I'm happy to, I was just sort of hoping
Yeah.
to have a
That's my understanding from my conversation.
Thank you.
That it's essentially the same thing. And the tax department confirmed
And
that.
I'm realizing that we're sort of about to go into the weeds, and I want to make sure you are having your chance to get into the big picture. Representative Beck.
Negotiated revenue or tax, which kind of functions like a tax. I mean, if somebody constitutionally checked this, that usually that's the legislature's got to set a tax. I mean, is somebody, has legal counsel weighed in on whether this negotiated revenue is constitutional? Do it that way?
It should be fine,
Think so?
because that's how the lottery works right now.
Right.
Oh, okay.
So I think the other thing to keep in mind is Vermont is not inventing this apparatus, right? We have 36 states that we can learn from. And so one of the things that we've been doing, the department, in terms of reaching out to our colleagues, so we operate tri-state, right? So it's Vermont Lottery and we participate in tri-state, and then we participate in Powerball with multi-jurisdictional. So we have relationships with other states and we rely on them to share information, which they readily do. So New Hampshire, for example, has been incredibly helpful. And I think you might hear from Charlie McIntyre, who's the commissioner of the New Hampshire Lottery. Very astute. He was a criminal prosecutor. He actually prosecuted organized crimes. And a lot of that was illegal sports booking. So you might want to chat with him about that if you want to get into the weeds. But
He's coming.
yeah, great, good.
Representative Anthony?
Yes, thank you. Two sort of broad areas. Having participated in the setup of cannabis a couple of years ago, we purposely, the committee, included what you referred to as a major objective for the study committee, but it was in the preamble of the statute, namely, bring the black market into the white market. But there's no preamble here. We're moving right into definitions. And I say that because it would guide your agency when you write a contract, when you review due diligence on the performance of that contract, and you ask, well, did you bring in the black market into the white market? since that's one of the overarching objectives. And it goes back to my being reminded that much of this is a delegation to you in spirit and in fact to be faithful in the renewal process, to be sure that the person the applicant, the operator, has performed according to his or her proposal when it was first issued. And in that context, then there would be some kind of mechanism to say, you didn't perform, and so you're out, we're going to rebid it. And frankly, that's when you might find out whether you were lowballed or not, if you rebid, if you will, the next generation of operators at some time. But there's nothing in the statute to guide you, and I'm bug on delegation issues, and so
I can speak to that.
Yeah.
If that would be helpful. So we at the Department of Liquor and Lottery have a multitude of contracts. Okay, and so we have major contracts with our lottery vendor. It's a $10 million, 10-year, $150 million contract. We have contracts with our agents, our liquor 802 Spirits agency stores. So the way it works internally is we have performance measures, and then we have, I'm not going to get the legal term, but we have the ability to either cancel the contract, renew the contract, or have liquidated damages if provisions aren't fulfilled. So we do that all the time, and we have a great general counsel that helps us with that.
And it's part of the,
different.
part of the negotiated contracting.
Correct.
How you're bringing people out of the illicit market and
Correct.
into the legal market. Okay.
Yeah, and it's it's also part of how the bill was structured, so that you're not creating those barriers to entry, right? So we heard a lot is that you want to make sure you're not requiring, Vermont does not want to be the only state that's requiring operators to do something. Because then you run the risk of the operators going, you know what, there's only 600,000 people in the state. There's not that many people. It's not worth it. So we talked about that a lot. You want to be mindful of what you're putting in statute, which is why they also want to make sure we're giving the department that authority and the flexibility to negotiate the best deal. I want to talk a little bit about problem gambling and responsible gaming. And so we obviously anticipate some risks, right? We're going to anticipate the risks, and then we're going to plan for them, and we're going to mitigate them. And that's part of what the requirements are for operators. It's requirements that, the department has to make sure we get a responsible gaming plan. And then we're going to fund, the revenue is going to help fund this responsible gaming problem gambling fund. So to your point, Madam Chair, exactly what I pointed out to House Gov Ops, right? So initially the bill had a 2.5% of the wagering revenue that the department gets goes to the problem gambling responsible gaming fund. That was based on testimony from the National Council of Problem Gambling. And then they inserted a floor. Somehow we got a floor put in there, a $500,000 floor the first year. Nope. Okay. So what I had pointed out to the committee is that the math is flawed if you have a $500,000 floor the first year. You will never see that. There's no one is projecting that there's going to be $20 million the first year to the state, let alone $40 million, which would be, ours would be 20 million, would be half of that. So instead of putting an artificial floor in, don't artificially fund the problem gambling fund. Fund it organically, just double the amount. So rather than have 2.5%, make it 5%. And 5% based on the estimates of JFO, the first year, JFO is basically projecting 4.8 million for the first year. 5% of that roughly is $250,000, right? And then the second year, they're projecting 10 million, so that's 500,000. So I see in the bill, the latest bill that was passed, they still have a floor there. I think that is unnecessary because based on the projections of JFO, you're going to see 5% achieve 250,000 and then 500,000 the next year. The other thing I pointed out to House Government Ops is that the Department of Liquor and Lottery right now already budgeted, not just this year, last year, like it's been in the budget for several years, is $250,000 for problem gambling. So we have that as, if we're looking to combine problem gambling, responsible gaming, whether it's coming from sports betting or whether it's coming from traditional Vermont lottery, which is what my colleagues and I in the Department of Mental Health have been talking about, and there was some discussion in committee. Well, we're bringing 250,000 already over from the Vermont lottery. And then you're going to raise the money depending on how much of a handle, how much of a revenue share we're able to negotiate.
So what if Vermont becomes the fantastic locus of all things sports wagering, and we see these amazing revenues, which are connected to fairly out of control gambling, and more money is going into this special fund, but it's actually like, for whatever reason, the Department of Health is not using particularly effective strategies to combat this addiction. And we're still pouring more and more money automatically into the fund every year because it's not part of the regular appropriations process, because it's just an automatic deposit into a special fund for the Department of Health to use. What safeguards do we have on this ever-growing percentage of money going into this fund?
So I think this sort of came up a little bit in the House Government Ops. I think it's safe to assume that if we get this passed and we set up sports betting in Vermont, the timing of that will be, with any luck, we have sports betting illegal by the end of the year so that we can take advantage of the Super Bowl, the NFL season, March Madness to bring in revenue. We want a robust sports betting book, right? If we're wanting revenue for the state that will then fund the problem gambling. So I think the thought was that at some point, the General Assembly is going to look at what's been done, how we're doing. The revenue projections are just projections. So what do we actually see? What is the revenue share that we actually were able to negotiate? And then I think the other thing to keep in mind is it's a very small market.
Yeah.
So while we want and we expect a robust revenue stream, I don't see where it's going to become this situation where we have so much money that it's in excess of the responsible gaming fund.
Okay. Yeah.
So by a small market, do you mean 630,000 people?
It's even less than that. 630,000 people can't bet. I mean, so we have a population of 660,000 people. So if you're under 21, you can't, according to this bill, you can't bet. If you're part of the liquor and lottery or the board or the operator, so you would have to imagine, there's a very small subset of the people that are betting.
So that's what you mean is Vermonters, people who live.
It's Vermonters, and it would be tourists, or second homeowners. So people that come to Vermont, they live in Connecticut, they live in Massachusetts. If we legalize sports betting, it's legal in Massachusetts and legal in Connecticut, then they could bet here. And that would be helpful because we could be getting those revenues from the sports betting that takes place in Vermont. It's not just Vermonters.
Okay, I understand that. So the people coming in from out of state to ski, for example, would also be able to bet.
Sure, they'd be able to take advantage of the online sports betting that's permitted in this bill.
And do you know how many people right now have a problem with gambling of the number of people in Vermont who could bet?
I can only share with you the experience we have with the Howard Center, okay? So the Vermont Lottery operates a problem gambling program. We give a grant to the Howard Center. It's $125,000 a year. I looked at the statistics last year. There were 10 referrals in 1 year for problem gambling. Now, that tells me a couple things, and we've been looking at this when I started to see that. Maybe we don't have a problem gambling problem in Vermont, right? So 10 referrals. Maybe we're not doing enough to make the public aware of the resources that exist. Now, admittedly, and I have many conversations with the Howard Center, not throwing them under the bus. They're the first ones to say we don't necessarily specialize in sports betting or gambling addiction. And I think that's part of the conversation that I have been having with my colleagues in the Department of Mental Health is that it's going to take time to build up that program. Right now, we have it for the Vermont Lottery. There's a little bit of consumer education. Like, first of all, you need to identify what is responsible gaming and what does that look like. And then you have to identify, here are the resources for problem gambling, and here's how you can access them. So I think there needs to be much more of a public awareness, much more of an education so that people know how to access those services. And I think that's some of the easy work that can be done, but building up the specialist, the addiction specialist that can treat problem gambling, that's what the Department of Mental Health is saying. That's going to take some time for capacity building.
If we legalize gambling in the way that's described in this bill, will there be more than 10
10 what?
people who have trouble with gambling?
I have no idea. I'm just giving you the experience of what we see with the relationships that we have with the Howard Center and Vermont Lottery. Well, if you think about, you can look at national studies, you could look at other states. Yeah. I mean, the other thing is to the accessibility. So you're online, right? So you're not going into a lottery agent and buying tickets. You're much more accessible because you have the phone. And it's also the folks that are participating in sports betting are, you know, not the over 50 crowd necessarily. It's the younger crowd.
And there aren't that many of those people here.
We're working on that. We're still working on that.
So my question is related to this, but it's a little bit more pointed, which is on page 24, there's a requirement that annually on or before January 15th, the department, in conjunction with mental health, will produce a problem gambling report.
Mm-hmm.
And so if this goes into, if this becomes law at, you know, upon passage this year, I'm just trying to think about, would we have baseline data to really understand how passing this law impacts our population kind of right away? So I know this is convoluted, stick with me for a second.
Sure.
So we have a report that comes out on January 15th of 2024.
Right.
That would serve as baseline data. Would you agree or disagree?
So if this passes if it becomes law, right, effective upon passage, the timing I'm estimating, we would be setting up a sports betting book at the end of the year. So you would have very little data in January 15, 2024, because you basically would just be having a sports betting book live.
Right,
So
and
it
I
would be
guess.
baseline then.
Yep.
Sort of, yeah. I guess what I'm sort of thinking about is, that would probably include data that would be absent if you consider the whole year, right? The data would include a lot of time that we were absent a sports book. Does that make sense? So we know like what it looked like right now, for example.
In January 15, 2024,
Yeah, we wouldn't have a sports book by then, right?
we would have a sports book. I mean, that's the goal, next January.
We had it for like 2 weeks.
Sure, so, exactly. Yeah, so we would have,
With all respect to you, I mean, government has not moved that.
right. Well,
You're very good at your job, but.
sports books do, though. All the other states have been able to set up sports books within, 6 months or less. New Hampshire, less.
Thank you.
Yes,
And we're
yes.
gonna get into fees when you're done with your question.
Part of what I appreciate, I think, about the intent here is that this creates an opportunity to put more guardrails and more safeguards.
Correct.
To, allow people to not use their credit card.
Correct.
Be, set their own limits to remove themselves, and I appreciate those. I guess I'm still struggling a little bit with some of our goals around like responsible gaming and the safeguards that we're putting in place, and this other explicit goal in the competitive bid process around maximizing long-term revenue for the state. Like, those seem a little bit at odds to me, that we're trying to like maximize revenue, which means like more and more people participating, but also putting in important safeguards to minimize addiction. Can you maybe just.
Speak to that?
Speak to that.
Yeah, that's what we do at the Department of Liquor and Lottery. That's the inherent balance, right? So our mission explicitly has commerce, right? We want to maximize sales to the state of liquor and gaming in a way because it brings money to the ed fund and it brings money to the general fund. And yet we want to do it in a way that's protecting safety and that has responsible consumption. So we balance that all the time in the department. We are an agency that's in enterprise funds. We have two enterprise funds. So we want people to buy liquor. We want them to buy it at an 802 Spirit stores. We want them to buy lottery tickets, and yet we want to do that in a responsible way. So that is the inherent balance that every single one of the people that work at the Department of Liquor and Lottery balance all the time. So this balance that we're talking about with sports betting is no different, right? We want to have revenue come into the state that's going to fund the responsible gaming and fund the general fund that's going to help with childcare or whatever else we want to do, right? So yeah, it's a definite balance.
And back to the question of just like fantasy, was there discussion about bringing it all together under one umbrella and having everyone?
Yeah, so let me talk about that a little bit because fantasy sports is legal right now in Vermont. You all got that. What happens with fantasy sports is that you register with a Secretary of State's office as an operator and you pay $5,000. And then there exist some consumer protections in statute, Title IX, that are now in here that that's supposed to prevent, against sort of abuses. There's no regulatory oversight. Basically, if there's a consumer complaint, they go to the AG's office through the Consumer Protection Division, and that's how it's handled. So very different than what we're talking about with sports betting. Okay,
There's a report in here that might look at all of that.
Correct. And they asked for the report. I asked for an extension of the report because hopefully I'm spending my time between now and the end of the year setting up a legal sports book, not writing a report about fantasy sports, which I know nothing about, but I will if this bill passes for sure.
So fee questions.
Yes.
So I imagine, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that each new operator and the regulation of an operator, I mean, there's sort of your base cost to regulate, but I imagine each operator costs a little bit more than the last operator. 3 operators would cost more than 1 operator because you have 3 relationships, 3 things you're regulating, 3 contracts. And so the idea of dividing up the fee part is very confusing to me.
So,
and as ensuring that your costs are covered.
I appreciate that. How we arrived at the 550 was the ongoing cost for the department to oversee the sports betting relationship, right? So we'd hire a director of sports betting, we'd hire a financial person, we have a sports betting consultant, we have the overtime, and then the IT. And so to your question, are we going to have more staff time overseeing 3 contracts as opposed to 2, or 4 contracts as opposed to 2?
6 as opposed to
6 as opposed to 2? Potentially, sure. I mean, that would be the director of sports betting. So, so potentially. Yes.
So are these fees set to cover if you wind up with the maximum number?
So you do the setting of the fees. I'm just sort of commenting and thinking out loud, which is always very dangerous in a public setting, about the cost to the department. And there are other states that do it as a one operating. This isn't a licensing fee, it's an operating fee. So you could arrive at you definitely want to have $550,000 covered in your fee, but you could arrive at a methodology where if it were, the minimum was 2 in the bill, but we could do 1 if we didn't get sufficient. So you could set a minimum of 550,000 as 1 operator, but if it were 2, you could graduate it.
Let's just keep.
I appreciate the question.
And then the fees for the fantasy sports, Secretary of State's office has like a whole sort of apparatus for collecting such things and regulating such things and registering things, and just want to make sure that you're giving thought to whether or not the fee is going to be sufficient and appropriate in a whole new home.
Yeah, and I raised that question with House Government Operations because you're taking basically a registration fee that goes to the Secretary of State's office and you're moving it to the Department of Liquor and Lottery. So we don't register businesses. The Secretary of State's office register businesses. What we do is we issue licenses and permits. We have a mechanism to do that because we have our online licensing portal. And I guess what we could do is call it a fantasy sports license. But I would have to look more to see what is actually required of the Secretary of State's office. I think it's pretty minimal.
I think so too.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean that that's the same thing that you would be doing in your office. So I just want to make sure.
Yeah, because I want to be really clear that this is not asking us to do any compliance.
Yes, I absolutely understand that.
We're not going to do any compliance monitoring or enforcement of fantasy sports. We're basically collecting the fee that would otherwise go to the Secretary of State's office. And we would technically call it a registration fee, but we do licenses and permits, basically.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go to the meeting in the cafeteria,
Have a good time.
continue having a great discussion and stuff, I'll catch up.
I'm available most anytime.
One of the safeguards for problem gambling was that people can't use credit cards to bet with.
Yes.
I know that a lot of people now have bank accounts that have their credit cards linked to them if they overdraft. Is there a mechanism for protecting with that, against that?
Great question.
Thanks.
The idea was there, obviously, is we don't want people to get overextended and to go into debt.
Absolutely. I feel like banks are really good at helping people get overextended right now. And so I'm not sure that mechanism does what it is meant to do. I know my bank, for instance, seems very intent on being overextended despite my efforts. No, I'm not overextended right now. I'm constantly getting sales pitches, right? Everyone is. Okay.
You already voted it out.
Yes, Representative.
One way, I did recall that the operator had to establish an account for each participant.
I'll go down and come back.
And that account could be, if you will, non-accessible, other than what money was deposited by the participant, the bettor. And there could be some safeguards to renewal of that, so that you wouldn't have the open access of an overdraft.
Yeah,
That's a piece I thought of.
exactly. And players can establish limits, right? So they can establish limits. You're only allowed to have one bank card linked to an account. You can't have multiple accounts on one operator. And then you can establish those limits. And then the operator has a mechanism to establish limits if they're seeing, erratic behavior.
So is it like a debit card, a bank card, you say?
Correct. Yeah. Not a credit card is what I'm
Right.
saying. Not a credit card. So,
I have another question.
of course.
Did you, when you were working with GovOps to draft this, there was a lot of language in the cannabis legislation around sort of understanding corporate ownership structures at application point. And I didn't see that mirrored as robustly in this legislation. I just wondered if that was a conversation that you were a part of.
I don't think I was not a conversation I was part of. The thing to keep in mind about the sports book operators is these are going to be national and international companies. They're one of the criteria we would be looking at is where else are you operating? What are the results there? So again, we're learning from 36 other states. So there's a market that has existed since 2018. It isn't the same as cannabis in that there might be a Vermont homegrown, pun intended, retailer or grower. There's not going to be that equivalent really in Vermont of a sports book that operates in Vermont. Or one that would meet the minimum criteria anyway.
Admitting, there's sort of the option for you to admit only one.
Yeah, because.
Rather than.
Correct,
canceling
or none.
that one.
Right.
And that's what, I'm curious about the choice that you would have the choice to sort of cancel the market rather than we would cancel the market if you didn't get more than two. Like it would automatically cancel.
Yes, so that's to not, the language is such is to prevent the department from having to select bidders that don't meet the qualification. You want to be able to, we obviously want to be able to make sure that we have the operators that are going to operate successfully. And if they're not meeting the criteria that we've identified, we have the ability to say, we're not going to choose any. I doubt I would use that unilateral decision, right? Seems like I would involve my board, my general counsel.
Representative.
Thank you. My experience with the torturous corporate separation language that you referred to in the cannabis bill was precisely to ensure some degree of competitiveness. So the worry in this context would be that the bidding was amongst arm's length transactors. And that would be the utility of having that language. If you're confident that you could spot a shill, okay. But that's the point of having it in the cannabis language, is to be sure you really had independent operators. And there was no behind the scenes conspiracy hatched in wherever overseas.
So because it's not in statute doesn't mean it can't be in the bid though, right? Like
I'm a
that's-
delegation
yes,
guy.
yeah.
I
No,
like
no,
to
no,
know
no, and that's
what the
a-
agencies
yeah.
are doing.
Yeah.
I think we're gonna have a lot more.
Yes.
Conversations. Would love for you to give some thought to sort of sufficient fees for both responsibilities, to make sure that we're setting it in a way that's gonna actually meet your needs long-term. If the market, no matter what shape the market takes. And we're gonna hear from a pile of witnesses tomorrow. I don't know if you're gonna join us for that as well.
No, Charles will
Sure, Charles will be here. So thank you.
do my day job.
Is there anything else you wanna?
No, I think this is good. It's 3:30 and, we'll have many more conversations, I'm sure. And I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Of course. Nice to see you all.
Thank
Good to see you.
I'm excited.
So we are going to switch gears. We're going to talk about captive insurance. We have an amendment from Maria Royal. We can have let me just finish my sentence and then we can take a quick break. We're going to have an amendment from Maria Royal because the dates in the bill didn't quite work for the changes. So that's going to happen. Emily is going to take us through the fiscal note. And then ideally, we are going to vote on this bill. If something else doesn't come up, let's try to keep other things from coming up. And we're going to take a 4.5-minute break.